So welcome to the third part of the lecture on business ethics, corporate social responsibility, and the natural environment. In this part, we're going to go through Objective 4 and Objective 5. Objective 4 is identifying the different methods of pursuing environmental goals. We're going to talk about four mechanisms: regulations, incentives, pricing permits, and pricing mechanisms and pollution permits, and then we're going to look at a combination of those four methods. We're also going to then move on to look at some of the emerging sort of broader issues related to ethics and social responsibility to the natural environment of business. That's to set the scene for what we're then going to be doing in the lectures and tutorials, which deal with a range of different in the lectures and tutorials. I should have said in the tutorials and the Moodle exercise, which apply these issues to real world situations. Note that there are also 3 videos that talk about the stance, the responses that businesses have taken, that farms in particular, or agribusinesses have taken in particular, to environmental issues, reflecting regulations, incentives, and pricing mechanisms, but the way they're responding in a way to be self-regulating or to limit and lobby about the changes in of their image in relation to these areas as they communicate with consumers. So regulations, incentives, pricing mechanisms, and the combination of these methods are the 4 ways that you can achieve environmental goals from a business and government perspective. And let me be truthful, sometimes businesses lobby, and there's been quite a strong lobby related to carbon pricing in Australia of businesses, not the resources businesses, the oil producers, the coal producers, but other businesses wanting a real pricing mechanism to enable them to go forward in a structured way to decrease uncertainty. And that's partly because many of the resource producers also are seeking incentives to convert their production of electricity, for example, into cleaner operations, while at the same time there's lobbying by coal miners in particular, but other resources, gas and oil, not to do that, to receive subsidies to establish a coal-fired power plant, for example. So let's look at how we achieve our environmental goals using each of these 4 methods. Regulations come from government. Regulations can also come from agreed practices within industry, and sometimes industry has a significant proportion or significant input into the nature of the regulation that is being put into place. Sometimes that input has a positive impact. Sometimes, usually it doesn't. It's about watering down the regulation. So you have regulation to control and determine how the pollution bill, how the cost of pollution that we talked about before, how you split it between public and private, between business, government and society. It provides legally enforceable standards. However, it creates some difficulties because you have a displacement cost from industry dislocation or industry relocation or industry shutdown as it moves from an environment where pollution is highly regulated to another place where it's not. We're going to talk about the shipbreaking industry later in this course. The shipbreaking industry in Bangladesh. When I was growing up in Adelaide, we still had shipbreaking in South Australia when I was a kid. Not in my working life, but when I was a really young kid. I remember being taken by my father down to look at a ship where they were going to break it in half to see it collapse and fall in half. It was a dirty business. It was not safe for the workers. It caused lots of pollution. It contaminated the Port River, which is already very contaminated because of other practices in the area. That was an example of an industry that is now in Bangladesh, where there's no or very low regulation for both workforces, which is what we're going to look at, but also for the environment more generally, which is also what we're going to look at when we're talking about international aspects of environmental, when we talked about the global trade aspects of environmental regulation. So we have that displacement cost of people losing their jobs because industry is too highly regulated and they go to an area where there's lower regulation. The other way is to provide incentives, where the government provides tax breaks or matching grants or transitional funding to minimise to create or incentivise a voluntary action. But that's likely to slow the process because it's voluntary. It's seen as a subsidy for polluters, but it does have the benefit from a political perspective of minimising government interference. And if you have, as we do in Australia, as we do in many Western democracies, one political grouping that believes in small government and one that believes in large government, at least through the rhetoric that they're presenting, minimising government interference and having a free market rather than a mixed economy may be in fact what they're trying to achieve. So incentives can be seen as a way that is increases that supports deregulation but still achieves the goals that you're trying to achieve related to pollution. The third way to do it is by putting a price, which is like the carbon tax, which exists in many countries, a market for pollution, the place pollution costs directly in the control of polluters. So pollution costs and mitigation become just another cost that firms have to deal with. They're either motivated to reduce this or they can pay for pollution permits. And that's why I put while in the objective it says pricing mechanisms and pollution permits. Pricing mechanisms are putting a price on it, establishing a market in which you can exchange your pollution for some offset elsewhere from another industry, can set limits on the amount of pollution a firm can produce related to its permits, but also enables firms to trade with their permits. That's the strongest market-based approach and seems to be the most the most effective approach that builds on solid regulation. But as we've probably established in Objective 1, 2 and 3, the whole business of working out who should pay for pollution and what pollution is and what the costs and benefits are of pollution compared with other societal costs that might arise, and economic costs that might arise from putting a price on pollution, means that normally there's no one ideal solution. You use a combination of methods, and to do that you need to take into account effectiveness and fairness, but you need also to remember that businesses lobby, and businesses are the ones that have powerful lobby groups. Yes, there are consumer lobby groups. Yes, there are ecological lobby groups, but ultimately the businesses normally have more financial power and more systematic lobbying. Whether or not you can in fact effectively create fairness depends on the political environment that you're seeking to work within. I really don't want to give the impression that all businesses don't care about environment, but they clearly are incentivized by cost. This is why we're seeing large solar arrays being built at universities over car parks, at businesses like department stores on their shopping centres on their roofs, or factory roofs, to offset the cost of pollution, because they've got the real estate, they just have to put the power generation in place. It's an economic response to pollution. Consider the complexities of environmental ethics and identify some of the deeper arguments and unresolved questions is our last objective. Now, in considering the complexities, one of the things I think we need to do is not have a slide that considers the complexities. We have talked over Objective 1, 2, 3, and 4 about the complex nature of environmental regulation and putting a value on pollution, a price on our natural environment. Talked about that with examples in the introduction as well. So what I want to do in this section is just briefly look at a couple of the deeper issues, some obligations for future generations, an issue, theoretical issue about nature, which you're not going to be examined on, but I think is useful. And finally, just a comment on our treatment of animals. Right. Western world uses most of the world's resources. The Western world has the largest ecological footprint. The Western world has benefited most economically and in terms of income from the exploitation of not only its own resources, but the resources of the developing world. Therefore, in my mind, I think you can create a fairly strong argument that is the Western world, the developed economies that need to be the economies taking the leadership in dealing with environmental issues. Our dependence on foreign resources also raises a variety of issues because the political and economic domination of other countries is something we had through colonial powers, and we tended to exploit economically developing countries, whether it was through formal colonization, the British Empire, the American Empire, the Japanese Empire, the Dutch, the German, etc., or whether it was through economic empires, which is often the way that America dealt with not having an empire, but having economic control over other countries and economic and political control over other countries. The question we have to ask is, does any nation have the moral right to consume a disproportionate amount of the world's finite resources? Now, that's too big a question to deal with in this course of business ethics, but it is a question I think you have to consider. What can we do to create a sustainable economic environment, sustainable business for the future? We have obligations to future generations to leave them with a habitable world. Even, I'm a lot older than most of this, well, all of you. I'm a lot older than all of you. But you're going to have a legacy for future generations as well as you enter business in the way that you behave, that you consider the natural environment. And we've got to ask the question, well, how do we pay things forward? And it seems to be incredibly easy that the zombie economic argument, that if we borrow and go into economic deficit at a time of crisis like the COVID crisis, if we increase our government borrowings, that we're creating a credit card debt for future generations. Now that they'll never be able to pay back. That's basically a zombie economic argument. Look at Paul Krugman's book on it. Look at Paul Krugman's article on it. Clearly, future generations can easily pay off debt. But we consider its use as a justification not to provide social support, not to provide social relief, not to invest in government infrastructure. Well, surely we should use exactly, if that's a valid argument for that political reason, surely it's a valid argument for the political reason of saying, well, we need to leave a high quality natural environment for future generations so there is sustainability. But how do we define what the specific rights of future generations are? So I suppose what I've just then done is identified some of the hypocrisy of political arguments, which shouldn't really be a surprise to all of you. Anthropocentrism says that nature is only valuable because humans value it. And the opposing view is nature has both an aesthetic and an ecosystem. The subsuming view is that nature has an intrinsic value. The opposing view, that aesthetic value is part of our ecosystem, it's required for sustainable future society, future business, future everything. And I suppose Greta Thunberg's argument, which you just looked, where Greta Thunberg basically said we cannot continue to have economic growth because of the impact it's having, continuously pursue economic growth because the impact it's having on society, surely there's a better way, fits within that nature as intrinsic value argument. We have to also ask ourselves about treatment of animals. Do animals have rights? Do they feel pain? Do they suffer? Is it moral for animals to be used in testing? Is it wrong to eat animals? All of these are issues that which could well occupy a great debate that would last far longer than we have in this lecture or this tutorial, but they are things to consider when you're considering your own perspective towards the natural environment. So what have we done in this lecture and the associated videos? And then we're going to extend that into the tutorial and the Moodle forum. We've identified and discussed the adverse effects business activities on the environmental context, including environmental degradation and resource depletion. We've identified ecology and discussed its implications for business. We've identified some of the moral problems underlying business abuse of the environment, including externalities and free riders and having a livable environment. We've talked about 4 methods: regulation, incentives, pricing mechanisms, pollution permits, and a combination of those to deal with environmental goals. And we've looked at the environmental complexities of environmental ethics. We just touched on that, recognizing that there are deeper arguments and unresolved questions that arise. I'll see you in the tutorial this week. On the unit website, as I mentioned, we've got these slides, the slides for this lecture, we've got the recordings for this lecture, we've got the video resources and also the CNN link to a CNN article, the Thunberg Trump at Davos article, which also has a video on it. We've got the activities for next week's tutorial, which evolves around one of the case studies from the textbook, and I'm going to post that case study, so it's really important that you read and prepare for that case study. And also there's the Moodle forum for the following week that will be posted today, outlining what I expect you to do, building on that, which in fact builds on the case study. See you in the tutorial on Zoom. Stay safe.